Amara Hughes could feel the heat of the moment climbing, the kind that made her want to lash out, demand accountability, and shed the composed exterior she had cultivated for years. But as much as she wanted to give Officer Barnes a piece of her mind, she saw the quiver in her son Jalen's lip. His little fists were clenched so tightly around the shopping list that it was now crumpled in his hand. The mere sight of his fear steadied her. She knew she had to handle this calmly for him. "Officer, I understand you have a job to do," Amara said, her voice as controlled as she could manage. "But I've already told you that my placard is valid. I'm asking you to let me finish my errand without further harassment." Barnes snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Harassment? Lady, we're just making sure everything checks out. You'd think you'd appreciate that." "Appreciate what exactly?" Amara asked, her tone clipped. "Being treated like a criminal in front of my son." Johnson, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably. He kept glancing between his partner and Amara, as though trying to muster the courage to intervene. "Sir," he began, voice tentative, "I think we've verified enough. Maybe we should." "Quiet," Johnson Barnes interrupted sharply. "This is exactly the kind of thing they train us to look out for." Amara's temper threatened to boil over. "The kind of thing you're trained to look for. What exactly does that mean?" Barnes took a step forward, his presence looming. "You know exactly what I mean." The implication in his words stung more than she cared to admit, but Amara didn't flinch. Years of courtroom experience had taught her how to hold her ground, even when everything inside her screamed to push back. She met his gaze evenly, her voice firm. "No, Officer Barnes, I don't. Why don't you explain it to me?" Before he could respond, a small crowd began forming around them. Shoppers stopped mid-errand, their curiosity drawn by the rising tension. Amara noticed several people pulling out their phones, recording the interaction. A familiar pang of unease coursed through her. She knew the internet's power to turn such moments into public spectacles, for better or worse. "Is she in trouble?" a woman's voice called from the edge of the gathering. "No," Amara replied quickly before Barnes could speak. "I'm not in trouble. Just being questioned for parking in a disabled spot with a valid placard." Barnes's scowl deepened. I'm going to ask you one more time to step aside while we verify everything." "Verify what?" a voice interrupted. It came from a burly man in his 50s who had been watching with his arms folded. "I saw her hang that tag when she parked. It's legit. Leave the lady alone." "Sir, we're handling this," Barnes barked, his irritation palpable. "Doesn't look like handling," the man shot back. "Looks like harassment." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Barnes's face turned red, but he stood firm, gesturing toward Amara. "This is police business. Back off." Amara couldn't help but notice Jalen's wide eyes darting around the scene, trying to make sense of the chaos surrounding them. She knelt down to his level again, gently cupping his chin. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "Everything's going to be fine." Jalen nodded slowly, but his body remained tense, his breathing shallow. "Why are they so mad, Mom?" he asked softly. She didn't have an answer that wouldn't break his already fragile sense of safety. Meanwhile, Barnes reached for his radio once more. "Dispatch, this is Barnes. We've got a non-compliant individual. Send another unit to Maple Avenue Grocery." "Non-compliant?" Amara shot back, standing tall again. "I haven't resisted anything. I'm standing in a parking lot with my son." "You're escalating the situation," Barnes growled. Amara laughed bitterly. "Escalating? The only person escalating anything here is you. You called for backup because I used a parking space I'm legally entitled to. You want to waste taxpayer dollars on that." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Someone muttered, "This is ridiculous," while another bystander called out, "Let her go already." Barnes turned sharply toward the gathering. "Everyone needs to back off. This is a police matter." One of the bystanders stepped forward, her phone held high. She was a petite woman with sharp features and a fiery gaze. "Not anymore," she said pointedly. "This is public accountability. We're not going anywhere." Amara felt a surge of gratitude for the woman, even as the situation spiraled further out of control. She noticed Johnson's hand hovering near his belt, not quite reaching for his weapon but visibly uneasy. "Officer Johnson," Amara said, addressing him directly. "You checked the placard, you know this isn't necessary. Please tell him to stop." Johnson hesitated, his eyes flicking to Barnes. "Sir, maybe we should." "Johnson," Barnes barked, cutting him off again. "Do not undermine me in the field." Amara exhaled slowly, her patience wearing thin. She glanced down at Jalen, whose expression had shifted from fear to confusion, and then back at the officers. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will," she said quietly but with conviction. And in that moment, the sound of distant sirens reached her ears. Backup was on the way. The weight of the moment hit her like a punch to the gut, not because she feared the approaching officers, but because she knew what this scene would look like from the outside. A black woman, standing defiantly against two white officers, surrounded by an agitated crowd. The narrative would write itself. Amara straightened her spine and held her head high. "Fine," she said evenly. "Do what you need to do. But I promise you, Officer Barnes, you're going to regret this." The crowd fell silent as the sirens grew louder, their collective attention focused on the unfolding scene. Amara reached for Jalen's hand, squeezing it tightly. She wasn't sure what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain: this moment would change everything. The courtroom was a sanctuary of formality and order, its polished wooden benches and imposing dais radiating authority. But to Amara Hughes, it was also a battlefield, a place where justice was fought for, line by painstaking line. Today, however, it felt more like a pressure cooker, the air dense with unspoken tension. The courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for prime seating, their cameras and notepads ready to immortalize the proceedings. Spectators filled the rows, their murmurs swirling like restless wind. Seated at the judge's bench, Amara adjusted her robes and scanned the docket. Her stomach churned as her eyes settled on the names of the defendants, Officer Darren Barnes and Officer Kyle Johnson. It felt like a cruel twist of fate that she, their recent victim, would preside over their trial. But the law demanded impartiality, and Amara intended to deliver it. She had spent the previous night reviewing the case file, a civil lawsuit brought by a black couple against the city's police department for alleged racial profiling and excessive force. The parallels to her own experience were almost too glaring to ignore. But she forced herself to focus on the facts, not her emotions. Order in the court, the bailiff's voice rang out, pulling her from her thoughts. The low hum of chatter died down as everyone rose to their feet. Amara's gavel struck wood with a resolute crack. "You may be seated." The room settled, and the trial began in earnest. The plaintiff's attorney, Carla Reyes, a petite woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached the bench. Behind her sat her clients, Marcus and Dana Thompson, their expressions a mix of determination and apprehension. "Your Honor," Reyes began, "this case is about systemic bias and the abuse of power. My clients, Marcus and Dana Thompson, were stopped by the defendants without probable cause. What should have been a routine interaction escalated into a harrowing experience, leaving them humiliated and traumatized." Amara listened intently, nodding for Reyes to proceed. The defense attorney, Richard Baines, a tall man with a commanding presence, sat impassively, his hands clasped on the table. Reyes continued. "The Thompsons were pulled over for what the officers described as suspicious behavior. My clients were returning from a church service, dressed formally and driving below the speed limit. Yet they were treated as criminals. Officer Barnes demanded they exit their vehicle at gunpoint, searched their car without consent, and made derogatory remarks about their character." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Amara's fingers tightened around her gavel, her mind flashing to her own encounter with Barnes. She had experienced firsthand his condescension, his unwavering belief in his own authority. But she pushed the memory aside, her face remaining neutral. Reyes paused, glancing toward the defendant's table. "We will demonstrate through witness testimony, police records, and video evidence that my clients were targeted solely because of their race. This case isn't just about the Thompsons, it's about holding those in power accountable." When Reyes sat down, the room seemed to collectively exhale. Amara turned to the defense. "Mr. Baines, your opening statement." Baines rose smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket as he strode to the center of the room. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen." He began, his tone calm and measured. "This case is not about race. It's about context. My clients, Officers Barnes and Johnson, were responding to a report of a stolen vehicle matching the Thompsons' car. Their actions, while perhaps abrupt, were in accordance with their training. Amara's gaze flicked to the officers. Johnson looked nervous, his hands fidgeting under the table. Barnes, by contrast, was the picture of defiance, his chin tilted up as if daring anyone to challenge him. The plaintiffs' claim they were treated unfairly. Baines continued, but the evidence will show that the officers acted professionally and with restraint. Any misunderstanding that occurred was unfortunate but not malicious. As Baines returned to his seat, Amara jotted a note in her pad. His argument was predictable but compelling enough to plant doubt in the minds of some jurors. It was her job to ensure those doubts were resolved by facts. The first witness called to the stand was Marcus Thompson. A tall man in his early 40s, Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity as he took the oath and sat down. Reyes approached him, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "can you describe what happened on the night of June 15th? Marcus took a deep breath. "My wife and I had just left our church's anniversary celebration. We were heading home, driving down Oak Street, when we saw police lights behind us. I pulled over, assuming it was a routine stop. And then, Officer Barnes approached my window. Before I could even greet him, he ordered me to step out of the car. I asked if I had done something wrong, and he shouted at me to stop resisting. I wasn't resisting. I was scared." Reyes nodded, her expression empathetic. "What happened next?" "He made me lie face down on the pavement while he searched our car. My wife was crying, begging him to tell her what was going on. When she tried to step out, Officer Johnson pointed his gun at her and told her to stay put." The courtroom murmured, the tension palpable. Amara watched Marcus carefully, noting the tremor in his hands as he spoke. His testimony was raw and authentic, a stark contrast to Barnes's rigid demeanor. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Reyes said. "No further questions." Baines rose for cross-examination, his steps deliberate. "Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that the officers searched your car. Did they find anything illegal?" "No," Marcus replied firmly. "And you claim you were targeted because of your race. Are you aware that the officers were responding to a report of a stolen vehicle?" Marcus hesitated. "I found that out later, yes." Baines pressed on. "So, isn't it possible that the officers were simply doing their job?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "If they were doing their job, why did they treat us like criminals from the start? Why didn't they explain what was happening?" Baines didn't respond immediately, letting the question hang in the air. Then he smiled tightly. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That will be all." As the trial progressed, more witnesses took the stand, including Dana Thompson and a bystander who had recorded part of the encounter on their phone. The video was played for the court, showing Barnes yelling at Marcus to get on the ground while Johnson kept his gun trained on the vehicle. The footage was grainy but damning, capturing the fear in the Thompsons' voices and the aggression in Barnes's tone. Amara's chest tightened as she watched. The parallels to her own arrest were undeniable. She recalled the way Barnes had loomed over her, his authority wielded like a weapon, and the humiliation of being treated as less than human. But she forced herself to remain impartial, her expression betraying nothing. When it was finally time for the defendants to testify, Amara's anticipation was tempered by a sense of dread. She had no doubt that Barnes would paint himself as the consummate professional, twisting the narrative to suit his perspective. And as he took the stand, his demeanor confirmed her suspicions, confident, unapologetic, and completely convinced of his righteousness. "Officer Barnes," Baines began, "can you walk us through your actions on the night in question?" Barnes nodded. "We received a report about a stolen vehicle matching the plaintiff's car. When I approached the driver, he seemed agitated and argumentative. For my safety, I asked him to exit the vehicle." "And did you use excessive force, as the plaintiffs allege?" "Absolutely not," Barnes replied firmly. "I followed protocol." Amara studied him closely, her gaze unwavering. Barnes's words were polished, but his body language spoke volumes, an air of superiority that grated against the very idea of accountability. When it was Reyes's turn to cross-examine, her tone was sharp. "Officer Barnes, do you believe all citizens deserve equal treatment under the law?" "Of course," Barnes said smoothly. "Then why," Reyes pressed, "did you assume Mr. Thompson was guilty before he even spoke?" Barnes bristled. I didn't assume anything. I acted on the information I had. Reyes's lips curved into a knowing smile. We'll see about that. As the session ended for the day, Amara banged her gavel and rose from her seat, her heart heavy. She knew the trial had only just begun, but the weight of the truth was already bearing down on her shoulders. And in the days to come, she would have to decide whether to wield justice as a shield or a sword. Amara sat at the bench, her gavel resting lightly in her hand as the next session began. The air was electric with anticipation. Today's testimonies would include Officer Johnson, the junior officer from the arrest, and crucial evidence submitted by the plaintiff's attorney. Amara braced herself. As much as she wanted to keep her focus on the facts, she knew that her own encounter with Barnes hovered at the edge of her thoughts like a shadow. "Call Officer Kyle Johnson to the stand," the bailiff announced. Johnson approached with visible unease, his eyes darting nervously across the room. His shoulders hunched slightly as he raised his right hand to take the oath. The contrast between him and Barnes couldn't have been starker. While Barnes exuded confidence and defiance, Johnson seemed burdened by doubt. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Carla Reyes said as she approached. "Kyle Johnson," he replied, his voice soft. "I'm a police officer with the city's 3rd precinct." Reyes wasted no time. "Officer Johnson, can you describe your involvement in the stop of Marcus and Dana Thompson?" Johnson hesitated, glancing briefly at Barnes, who sat at the defense table. His expression seemed to carry a silent warning, and Johnson visibly swallowed before speaking. "I was the assisting officer. I followed Officer Barnes's lead." "And what did that involve?" Reyes pressed. Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He instructed me to cover the passenger side of the vehicle while he engaged with the driver. "Did you observe anything during the stop that seemed suspicious or indicated the plaintiffs were involved in criminal activity?" Johnson hesitated again, his gaze dropping to the floor. "No, ma'am. They were cooperative." Reyes's tone hardened. "So in your opinion, was there a need for Officer Barnes to escalate the situation by ordering Mr. Thompson to the ground at gunpoint?" Johnson's head snapped up, his panic evident. I can't speak to his decision-making. He was the senior officer. I just did what I was told." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Amara rapped her gavel once, silencing the crowd. She noted the way Johnson avoided making direct eye contact with anyone, his discomfort painting a picture of a man caught between loyalty to his partner and the truth. Reyes leaned in slightly, her voice softening. "Officer Johnson, I understand this may be difficult, but this court is seeking the truth. Did Officer Barnes make any statements during the stop that suggested racial bias influenced his actions?" Johnson froze, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. The seconds stretched into an unbearable silence, the entire room hanging on his response. Finally, he exhaled and spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He said something about people like them." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Barnes's face twisted into a scowl. Amara felt a pang of both vindication and frustration. Johnson's admission wasn't surprising, but hearing it aloud brought a clarity that couldn't be ignored. "What exactly did he say?" Officer Johnson, Reyes pressed. "He said, you've got to watch people like them. They're always up to something." Johnson's voice cracked, and his eyes darted toward Barnes, who glared back at him with barely concealed fury. Reyes nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Officer Johnson. No further questions." When Richard Baines rose to cross-examine, his stride was purposeful, his expression unreadable. "Officer Johnson," he began smoothly, "you mentioned that Officer Barnes instructed you to act as backup. Is it standard procedure to follow the lead of the senior officer on a call?" "Yes, sir," Johnson replied, his voice steadier now. "And would you agree that officers often have to make split-second decisions based on their experience and instincts?" "Yes, but..." Baines cut him off. "Thank you. And would you also agree that in the heat of the moment, it's possible to misinterpret someone's words or intentions?" Johnson hesitated, his earlier nervousness returning. I suppose it's possible." Baines offered a small, satisfied smile. "Thank you, Officer Johnson. That will be all." The final blow of the day came in the form of video footage captured by the plaintiff's dash cam, which Reyes introduced as evidence. Amara watched as the footage played on the large screen, the courtroom bathed in its cold glow. The video clearly showed Barnes shouting at Marcus to get out of the car and stop acting suspicious even as Marcus calmly asked what he had done wrong. The audio was damning. Barnes's voice, filled with irritation and condescension, echoed through the room. "You people always play innocent until we catch you in the act." Amara's grip on her gavel tightened. Her professional exterior remained intact, but her mind raced. There it was, undeniable proof of the prejudice at the heart of the case. She glanced at Barnes, whose face remained impassive, though a faint flush had crept up his neck. The video continued, showing Marcus complying with every command, his hands visibly shaking as he lay face down on the pavement. Dana's voice could be heard sobbing in the background, begging Barnes to stop as he rummaged through their car without explanation or consent. When the footage ended, the courtroom was silent. Amara took a deep breath, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "Court is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. She banged her gavel, the sound reverberating through the tense air. As the room emptied, Amara remained seated, her thoughts heavy. The truth was coming to light, but she knew the fight for justice was far from over. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as the final day of the trial began. The tension in the room seemed almost tangible, pressing against Amara Hughes as she took her seat at the bench. Today she would hear the closing arguments before deliberating on one of the most pivotal rulings of her career. The stakes felt enormous not just for the Thompsons, but for the larger conversation about systemic racism in law enforcement that this case had ignited. Amara tapped her gavel. "Court is now in session. Counsel, you may proceed with closing arguments." Carla Reyes rose, her confident stride carrying her to the center of the courtroom. Her demeanor was calm but forceful, every word she spoke carrying the weight of truth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reyes began, addressing the panel with a piercing gaze. "This case is not just about Marcus and Dana Thompson. It's about a pattern of bias, a pattern that has been allowed to fester unchecked. My clients did nothing wrong. They were cooperative, respectful, and entirely within their rights. Yet, they were treated as threats, dehumanized, humiliated, and placed in fear for their lives." She gestured toward the defendants. The officers in question, particularly Officer Barnes, acted not out of necessity or adherence to protocol but out of prejudice. His words, his tone, and his actions reflect an underlying bias that cannot be ignored. Reyes paused, letting the weight of her statement settle over the room. "We are not asking for sympathy. We are asking for accountability. My clients deserve justice, and our society deserves better from those entrusted to protect and serve. Thank you." The courtroom fell silent as Reyes returned to her seat. Amara nodded, then turned her attention to Richard Baines, who stood and approached the jury with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," Baines began, his voice smooth and reassuring, "my esteemed colleague has presented a compelling narrative, but I urge you to focus on the facts. Law enforcement is not a perfect science. Officers must make decisions in real time, often with limited information. Officer Barnes and Officer Johnson acted within their training. They responded to a report of a stolen vehicle, a situation that requires vigilance." Baines's voice softened, adopting a tone of reason. "Was the encounter unpleasant for the Thompsons? Undoubtedly, but unpleasant does not mean unlawful. The plaintiffs have failed to prove that the officers acted out of malice or racial bias, without clear evidence. We cannot condemn those who put their lives on the line every day to keep our streets safe." He returned to his seat with a final, measured glance at the jury. "Thank you." The jury was excused to deliberate, and Amara adjourned the court for the day. As the room emptied, she remained seated, her mind swimming with the complexities of the case. The legal arguments were straightforward, but the moral implications loomed far larger. Amara was no stranger to the struggles faced by people of color in a justice system that often failed them, and now she sat at the fulcrum of change, holding the scales of justice in her hands. She retreated to her chambers, where the quiet offered a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere of the courtroom. She sank into her chair, staring at the stack of notes and evidence on her desk. For a moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all, the expectations placed on her as a black woman in a position of power, the echoes of her own encounter with Barnes, and the knowledge that her decision would ripple far beyond this single case. The knock on her door startled her. It was Regina, her clerk, holding a fresh cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this," Regina said, setting the mug on the desk. Her expression softened as she studied Amara's face. "Tough one, huh?" Amara nodded, wrapping her hands around the warmth of the cup. Tough doesn't begin to cover it. Regina hesitated, then leaned against the desk. "Whatever you decide, Judge Hughes, it's clear you care about getting it right. That's what matters." Amara offered a faint smile. "Thanks, Regina. I just hope it's enough." As the hours passed, Amara reviewed the case file one final time. She read through Marcus and Dana's testimony, replayed the damning video footage in her mind, and considered Johnson's reluctant admission. She thought about Barnes's unrepentant demeanor, the way he seemed to embody the very attitudes that undermine public trust in law enforcement. But she also considered the broader implications. A ruling in favor of the Thompsons could set a powerful precedent, forcing accountability in a system resistant to change. Yet it would also invite scrutiny, criticism, and perhaps even backlash. Amara knew she would be judged just as much as the case itself. By the time she returned to the courtroom to deliver the verdict, her decision was clear. Her voice was steady as she addressed the room, each word chosen with care. This court recognizes the immense responsibility placed on those who wear the badge, as well as the profound trust placed in them by the public. When that trust is violated, the consequences reach far beyond the individuals involved. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. In this case, the evidence presented demonstrates a clear abuse of power fueled by racial bias. The actions of Officer Barnes were not only unprofessional but also discriminatory, causing harm to the plaintiffs and undermining the integrity of law enforcement as a whole. The room was silent as she delivered her ruling. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs, Marcus and Dana Thompson. The defendants, Officer Darren Barnes and Officer Kyle Johnson, are held accountable for their actions. And the city is ordered to implement mandatory bias training and oversight measures to prevent future incidents of this nature. Amara's gavel struck the bench, marking the end of the trial. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, a mix of relief, outrage, and quiet vindication. Amara stood, her expression composed, but her heart beat heavily in her chest. She had done what she believed was right, knowing it was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The courtroom was still buzzing from the verdict. Reporters whispered furiously into their phones, typing rapid notes, while spectators exchanged a cacophony of emotions: relief, anger, astonishment. Amara Hughes stepped back into her chambers, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her, muffling the noise outside. She exhaled deeply and leaned against the desk, her mind racing. The ruling had been a victory for justice, but it didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like a step into the storm. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Regina, her clerk, entered cautiously. "Judge Hughes," she began softly, "the media's all over this. There's already talk of how your decision might influence similar cases." Amara gave a weary nod. "Let them talk. This ruling isn't about headlines. It's about accountability." Regina hesitated. "True, but you know how this city is. Some people won't take kindly to what they see as an attack on law enforcement." Amara straightened, her spine stiffening. "Justice isn't about taking the easy path, Regina. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." Regina's face softened into a proud smile. "I knew there was a reason I wanted to work for you." Amara chuckled lightly, her tension easing for a moment. "Thank you. Now let's see how this unfolds." The Thompsons were waiting outside the courtroom when Amara finally emerged. Marcus and Dana approached her cautiously, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and weariness. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice thick with emotion, "we can't thank you enough. You didn't just give us justice, you gave us hope." Amara offered a small, sincere smile. "It's not me you need to thank. You stood up for yourselves when it mattered most. I just made sure the law heard you." Dana clasped Amara's hand, her eyes shimmering with tears. "It means everything to us. But, does this really change anything? Will they listen now?" Amara hesitated. She wanted to reassure Dana, to promise her that things would get better. But she knew the fight for change wasn't over, it never was. "This is a start," Amara said firmly. A single case won't fix everything, but it can set the tone. It can show people that accountability is possible. The couple nodded, their resolve hardening. Then we'll keep fighting, Marcus said. For people like us. For everyone. As they turned to leave, Amara felt a flicker of pride. Their determination mirrored her own, and it gave her hope that the ripples of this case might spread farther than she could imagine. Meanwhile, Officer Kyle Johnson sat in the break room of the precinct, his hands trembling as he sipped his coffee. The verdict had been a blow, but not an unexpected one. He'd known it was coming the moment he confessed Barnes's words on the stand. Still, the weight of it lingered, pressing down on his chest like a physical burden. Barnes stormed into the room, his face a mask of fury. Can you believe that? She threw us under the bus. That woman. She shouldn't even be a judge. Johnson flinched at the venom in Barnes's voice. Darren, maybe. Maybe what Barnes snapped, slamming his hand on the table. Maybe we were wrong? Don't start that crap again, Kyle. Johnson swallowed hard, his voice faltering. We were wrong, and you know it. Barnes glared at him, his eyes narrowing. Careful, rookie. You think you've got a career left after today? You think anyone in this precinct is going to back you after what you pulled on that stand? Johnson met his gaze, his fear giving way to a simmering determination. Maybe I don't deserve a career here if it means ignoring what's right. Barnes scoffed and shook his head, storming out of the room. Johnson sat alone, staring into his coffee cup, his mind swirling with thoughts of what lay ahead. He didn't know if he could survive the fallout, but for the first time he felt like he'd done something meaningful, something honest. Later that evening, Amara returned home to the quiet comfort of her modest house. Jalen sat at the dining table, bent over his homework. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with a smile. Mom, did you win? Amara paused, her heart swelling at his innocence. It's not about winning, baby. But we did what was right. Jalen grinned. That's kind of the same thing, isn't it? She laughed softly, walking over to kiss the top of his head. Maybe it is. As she moved to the kitchen to start dinner, the television in the living room caught her attention. A news anchor was summarizing the trial, the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen: Judge rules against officers in racial profiling case. Tonight's ruling has sparked heated debate. The anchor said, with civil rights leaders applauding the decision as a landmark victory and police unions decrying it as an attack on law enforcement. The case has reignited conversations about racial bias in policing, and many are calling for broader reform. Amara turned away from the screen, her thoughts heavy. She knew the backlash would come. The police union would likely appeal the ruling, and her name would be dragged into political debates. But she also knew she had made the right choice. Days later, Amara sat in her chambers, reviewing a stack of letters that had poured in since the verdict. Most were from community members thanking her for her courage, but others were less kind, accusing her of being biased or undermining law enforcement. She sifted through them with a calm resolve, letting neither the praise nor the vitriol distract her from her purpose. One letter stood out, handwritten in neat cursive. It was from Officer Kyle Johnson. Your Honor. I wanted to thank you for your fairness during the trial. I know I could have done more to prevent what happened that night, and I'm working to be better. Your ruling didn't just hold us accountable, it showed me that change is possible, even from within the system. I'm not sure where my career will go from here, but I want you to know that I'll carry this lesson with me wherever I end up. Sincerely, Kyle Johnson. Amara read the letter twice, her chest tightening with emotion. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a sign that even the most rigid systems could crack under the weight of truth. As Amara stepped out of her chambers that evening, the setting sun bathed the city in warm hues of orange and gold. The courthouse steps were quiet, but she could feel the ripple of her decision moving through the streets, through the conversations happening in homes and communities. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a meaningful start. She walked down the steps, her head held high. Change was slow, and the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long time, Amara felt a deep sense of purpose. Justice had spoken, and she would ensure it continued to be heard.